In this chapter, we will learn how to use the basic features of the software Knald's Baker mode to quickly create and export detailed masks for use when texturing. Before we get started, here's the website for Knald. Literally, just type in Knald into any browser. You should be able to find it pretty quickly. Uh, I'm not plugging them or anything, but literally, it's an amazing price for this, like $100, and you can work on this, or you can even download it for free. I recommend you guys try this out. So what we're going to do is we're going to export two meshes. We're going to export the high poly mesh. Right now it's at the highest level. So I'm going to first, I think I'll just export the low poly first. So I'm going down to my lowest level and I'm going to export. And remember, this has our UV maps on it. So Amulet low poly. Save that. And that's really, really quick. And then the high poly model will take a little bit longer because you can see we've got a lot of polygons in here. So we're going to export this. I'm going to call it Amulet High Poly. This may take a minute or two, so I'll probably speed up the tutorial while this exports. Save, and then up here you'll see it going in just a minute. So I'm going to speed it up and be right back when this gets all the way down here. Okay, now you can see that we have our high poly and low poly models. So let's head on over to Knald. And by default, the baker that you can see over here is not loaded. So what we want to do is we're just going to come over here where it says main and click load baker. And now you can see that this is active. You could also go over here, file, and then load baker. So down here, by the way, I'm not an expert with Knald, so I'm just going to show you some of the basics and why I use it. I use it for quickly baking masks. So up here you can see the exported size of your maps, or basically how the maps are going to be created at what size. High poly, what we're going to do is we're going to load our high poly mesh into that section, and then our low poly one, we're going to load that as well. And this is how it's going to bake between here. And now I believe we just go to, oh, sorry, we need to go back to Baker. Let's say down here for bake targets, just say add all. We want to add all these different maps into here. And then I'm just going to click this pre-process, and what you'll see is it's going to open up Knald's 3D previewer. And currently it's loading the high poly mesh because it's pretty dense, and then what you're seeing in the viewport is the low poly mesh. So that's where it's important that the low poly mesh has those nice UVs on there that are relaxed, because we're going to bake it down from the high poly. If you don't have it relaxed and you have UVs that are overlapping one another, you'll notice in the end it's just not going to look correct. So now I want you to notice down here on the bottom, you can see these different calculations that are occurring. This is creating each of the different maps out of Knald. And Knald is a procedural, sorry, not procedural, it's a progressive, meaning it works off of a GPU, and kind of like Keyshot, sorry, yes, Keyshot, it will update on the fly, which you'll see in a few minutes once I start playing around with some different settings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just drag this viewer over a bit, because I want to show you up here the tab that lets us preview between different maps. Now the 3D viewer, basically just left clicking, you can move around in here, and I think it's if you hold down on Alt and then right click, you can drag it around. You can use a mouse wheel to zoom in and out, and you can also hold down Alt and use a left click to zoom in and out. And then middle mouse will allow you to pan. Over here on the other side where the maps are, you just left click the mouse to drag this down or zoom in and out, and then you're using the middle mouse to pan and drag. I'm just going to kind of zoom in here on one section of the maps. So now what we can do is you can click on any of these different maps that it's created. It's created a bunch of different maps. Neural maps, derivative maps, all sorts of interesting stuff. I'm not going to use all these, but I wanted to show you all the different ones that it makes. The ones that we're going to be using the most are the concavity and the convexity. And by the way, this is just kind of an option if you didn't want to use the ZBrush's baking methods. And sometimes I use this because on really, really, really heavy meshes, it's extremely fast. Sometimes I have a 70 million poly mesh, like my Dark Souls goblet, and it was taking a really long time to export maps out of ZBrush. I could bring it in here, and it's done within a minute or two. So one thing I do want to show you again with kind of how the procedural method works, just to demonstrate this, is on each of these different map settings, whenever you click on something, currently I have Ambient Occlusion selected. You can see down here at the bottom, there's these different Baker AO settings. Any of these different ones you click between, you'll see some different settings that you can play with. For example, this concavity here, I'm just going to increase this a bit, and we should see this updating on the fly. So the scale, I'm just increasing that to get it to work better. And then over here on the right, it's kind of nice. You can flip between different maps. Sorry, it's going off the screen here. You can't quite see it, but I'm going to go ahead and select concavity as well. And then you can see this on your 3D model, how it's actually reacting. And this is similar to that dirt mass that we created out of ZBrush. So I'm just going to crank that up a bit more and then have that. I think this is like a little bit too perfect, but you kind of get the idea of how this can work. So the other thing I'm going to show you again once is going back to the ambient occlusion. This is, I'm going to match it over here as well. Sorry, I'm kind of jumping back and forth here. What I want to show you guys is how this progressive baking works with your GPU. So the raise by default is at 5, 12, and then 10. The more you increase this, the more calculation and processing time it's going to take. But just look closely at this, and you'll see things updating in real time as I play with the raise here. You can also see down here it says it's calculating. See how it's updating and giving it more resolution. This is just showing you how quickly you can adjust settings and then see some results in real time. That's one thing I really, really, really love about Knald is this progressive ability. So if you have good GPUs, it can work really quickly with your system. The other thing that is important to know is that Knald currently, when you're using this Baker, it only works with one UV domain offset. So if you're doing multiple UV offsets, like a lot of people do in movie production pipelines, you're only going to be able to bake to the UVs that are at 00 UDOM. So anyways, what I'm going to do is I don't care about a lot of these maps, so I basically only want the concavity and convexity. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to hit this minus sign beside all the maps I don't want. So I'm just removing them because I don't need to save any of those. So now I only have concavity and convexity. So I'm going to flip to convexity. And over here, I'm also going to switch to convexity. One thing I want to show you that's really nice is remember how we were having some of those issues in ZBrush where it was having a hard time kind of getting some of the edges here. You can see here that it's getting it quite nicely out of Knald, so we wouldn't have to go in and hand paint any of that. So already that saves me about 30 minutes of time for something like this. And then imagine a really complicated model like my Dark Souls goblet. When I was doing that, it was just Knald was amazing for getting these edges. And again, we can also play with the contrast here so that maybe we want to get the edges of this stuff firing up a bit more. So we can turn up the scale and then turn up the contrast a bit. So what we'll do is once we get to ZBrush, I'm going to show you some comparisons between these two masks, and you can kind of play around with which ones you want. Now you'll notice sometimes you'll get some weird kind of baking going on where you get a really bright edge like that. Now, if you needed to, you could go paint that out when you're in 3D. But for me, I'm not going to worry about it too much because it's probably not going to show up with what I'm doing. You can see what it's doing right there. But that's the basics of it. Now what we want to do is actually export our maps. So I'm going to come back over here. I'm going to click on export, export path, and I'm just going to use one of our paths we had, masks. I think this is the one that we exported from ZBrush. That's fine with me. So let's click that, select folder. And then if we come back over here to main, we can change the name. So I'm just going to call this Knald Amulet, and then underscore to leave a space. And then literally all you have to do is say export. Now you can see it exporting those. And if we go into Photoshop, we should be able to open these up and take a look at them. Okay, cool. So you can see in here, let's just open these. Oops. So that we can see them. Okay. All right, here's our convexity, which is more like, as you remember from ZBrush, this would be called our highlight mask. And then we have our dirt mask. And you'll notice like a bunch of kind of funky things going on here in the empty spaces. Don't worry about that because you'll never see it. Your UVs, this is empty, dead space. It doesn't really matter. One thing I'm going to do really quick too is I'm going to open up those original masks that we had from ZBrush, and we can just kind of compare these. Now the UVs are flipped because ZBrush does that weird thing with the flipping around of stuff, uh, but that's not a big deal. So Amulet Dirt Mask, I'm just going to select all, copy. I'm going to paste this in here so we can have a good look at this. I'm going to come over here, edit, make a copy of this, edit, transform, flip horizontal. Oops, I meant to say flip vertical. So let's just kind of compare these two. Now, one thing that's nice is Knald is catching all these little tiny details through there, which I think is pretty nice. One thing I like about ZBrush is it's blending a little bit nicer on the edges here, making it a little bit more broken up. Either way, I think either of these in KeyShot might just feel a little bit too sharp and dark around the edges. And that's where we may want to, in the end, do something like we'll copy this, turn it into a multiply, which means it's just sitting on top of the surface. To demonstrate that, you can see here, I'm going to undo that. And then you could do something like a blur on this, maybe a Gaussian, just so you have a little bit of a better blur between the edges, which will kind of help the dirt out. Okay, and then the final one, let's just take another look at I think it's the convexity. I'm going to copy this and I'm going to put it in here. Let's paste that. I'm going to flip this one this time, edit, transform, flip vertical. And let's compare these two. So this is the one that came out of Knald, and then this is the one out of ZBrush. So I think in the end, I'm probably going to use the one out of Knald for this point, for this one, for the highlight mask, and I'll probably use the dirt mask from ZBrush. So yeah, you can really, it's kind of fun playing between each of these to see which ones that you're going to like better. But this will add some nice little highlights later whenever we want to make the edges of the amulet brighten up. So that's all there is to it. Now you know how to use Knald for baking actual maps from a high poly model to a low poly model. And like I said, if you guys want to play with it, you can go through ZBrush and you could export your own normal maps. And then you would be able to take the normal map into Knald with a low poly mesh, and then you can put it in here. And the cool thing about that is once you load the normal map, you can go through these different map settings and make changes to things. Like you remember down here, we were adjusting the contrast, etc., and get some pretty interesting results with even more settings that you can change. You can see, for example, blur amount and stabilization is disabled. Whenever you bring in your own normal map, you can use those. So yeah, there's something I want to show you guys, and after that, I think we're just going to go back to ZBrush and prep our gem to send over to KeyShot as well as the Amulet, and then we'll start texturing this. This tutorial and its downloadable content is available now on my QBrush, Gumroad, and Steam stores, which are linked in the description below. Watch the following video to see what is included with your purchase. If you purchase this tutorial, here is a preview of all the bonus content you will receive. Firstly, in ZBrush, I've included 3 different versions of the amulet. 1, my final sculpted version with all the ornamentational details and destruction. 2, just the sculptural details like ornamentation. 3, a version without anything so you could follow along and create your own during the process. Secondly, you will receive the final KeyShot file demonstrated here, which contains all of the texture maps, lighting, and everything that is shown during the tutorial. The thing that I find really useful about this is having access to the material graph and seeing the complex custom materials that are created during the tutorial. This will really help you with understanding how to create your own complex materials in KeyShot. Next, you will receive all of the final Psd files showcased throughout the tutorial, including this gold-painted Mount Fuji design with all of my different layering processes, as well as the custom crest base that is used later for sculpting in ZBrush based off of masks.
Also, you'll get all of the final texture maps that are showcased during the tutorial, such as these, which are all tileable. You will also receive all of the original videos in downloaded format at their full high definition resolution. Also, I have included dozens of high quality personal art images such as my Dark Souls 3 High Lord of Walnor fan art, which inspired me to create the Amulet tutorial to showcase the techniques I learned and developed during the process. Whether you purchase this tutorial or follow along for free on Facebook or YouTube, thank you for your continued support, and I cannot wait to see the epic amulets you create soon.